Okay, good. So let's go for the third part. In the third part of the session today, I'm going to be a little bit more, let's say, classic in terms of cognitive neuroscience class, discussing about the anatomy of prefrontal cortex and different parts that we have in prefrontal cortex. First of all, I have added this kind of really beautiful DTI picture from the corpus callosum and how corpus callosum is connecting different parts of the brain to each other and how these parts are connected from the right to left side. But meanwhile, these pictures are beautiful, but they are not representing whatever is happening. So they are good to have, but meanwhile, I'm not sure that how much this is going to inform us about the prefrontal cortex and its structure. At least we can say that these parts are pretty much connected. But I brought this picture because it was in the textbook that we are reading together today. But meanwhile, I should say when we have, let's say, one fiber here, this fiber or fibers that we have here, it doesn't mean that we have a white matter tract like this. And even the diameter of fiber that we have is not related to the actual diameter of the white matter tract that we have here. Whatever we have here is just related to the size of the voxels within the DTI imaging that we are doing. So they are not real white matter tracts. They are just reconstruction of white matter tracts based on the DTI method. So do not think that they are actual white matter tracts and then the size would be the same, or they are just kind of a level of representation or computational representation of the reality that we have in the white matter tracts. But they are beautiful in terms of, I think, at least showing that, the right and left parts of the brain are actually connected to each other pretty extensively through what we call as corpus callosum. But let's go to the prefrontal cortex and the structure that we have for the prefrontal cortex. The simplest categorization of the prefrontal cortex could go for something like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and frontopolar or anterior frontal cortex, and then this part which we call medial prefrontal cortex. So that is going to be a really simplistic definition or categorization of prefrontal cortex, dividing that to the lateral part, ventrolateral, anterior parts, and parts that we have. And sometimes we can name here as dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. So these are the namings that we might have in a really simplistic way for the prefrontal cortex. But you know that we have some Broadman area definition for prefrontal cortex that is going to be important. We discussed that the primary motor cortex would be area number 1. So this is the M1 or primary motor cortex. And then area 6 is what we call the premotor. So M1 would represent really simple one by one area represented to one specific muscle, let's say bundle. And if we stimulate one specific area in the motor cortex, we have one or a series of bundles of muscle fibers that would get contracted. So it's just a one by one representation from cortex to muscles. And then when we get to perimotor cortex, it goes to more complex patterns of behavior. Let's say a specific one move or this move or the other move. It is not just one single muscle. It goes to a combination of different muscles that could have more complex actions or maps of action. So that is the reason that when we have M1, we can just represent that as something like a homunculus or the human body, showing that different parts of the human body would have one by one correspondence between motor cortex and different levels of muscle that we have. But in perimotor cortex, things would get a little bit more complex in terms of the combination of different muscles that are working. And then over when we go to the, let's say, the parts that we have in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, things get even more complex. And then we discussed that we have area 44, 45, 46, 47 in this part of the cortex, and area 11 and 12 and 10 and 9 here. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 here. As you can see here, this area that we call that anterior cingulate cortex, we are not naming that as prefrontal cortex right now, but they are still a part of the prefrontal cortex. So area 25, 32, 33, 24. So these are parts of what we call anterior cingulate cortex. So this is the general overview about the structures that we have from Brodmann areas. We know that prefrontal cortex acts as a hub in terms of receiving information from almost all around the brain to the prefrontal cortex. So we have a great representation of different parts of the brain to the prefrontal cortex. And also we have feedbacks from prefrontal cortex to almost every single part of the human brain. So these parts are highly connected and highly interacting to each other. And sometimes we have connections from prefrontal cortex even to things like hypothalamus and cerebellum and basal ganglia. And this is how we have been discussing before in terms of how conscious DLPFC might be able to have control on some of the non-conscious or subconscious or subliminal areas in the brain through what we call top-down control or top-down modulation. So these are the things that we have discussed about before to some extent. Even when we talk about, let's say, Brodmann area 11, Brodmann area 11 is going to be divided into, let's say, lateral and medial part. And then there might be some merging between, let's say, area 47 and 12 and dividing them into some other parts. So you can see that even within the Brodmann areas, we can have some, let's say, subdivisions or other levels of integration of different parts together if the parts are more similar to each other in terms of their structure or the cytoarchitecture. As you can see here, we are looking to the brain from bottom to up, and we are looking to this area that we call orbitofrontal cortex, because we have orbits here. So we basically have eyes here, and we are looking from down to top from here, and this is the orbitofrontal cortex. And there are specific implications for these pieces that we are discussing about. When you go to Brainotome Atlas, you can see how these parts are divided into pieces and how these pieces are going to be important. And as the homework for the next session, you are going to explore whatever we have in the prefrontal cortex with different parcellations in atlases and learn about that. And I will discuss about that in the next parts as well.